Buenos días.
Good morning to our colleagues. I would like to say to our colleagues from ICTs to check that we are okay with the streaming of this press conference. Yes? Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, everyone from from ECLAC, Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, located in Santiago, Chile. May you all be very welcome to this press conference that will present the annual report entitled Direct Foreign Direct Investment in Latin America and the Caribbean 2023. We are holding this press conference both face-to-face and virtually, transmitting this using all our platforms, Zoom, and via Zoom. We're accompanied by our colleague journalists who have not been able to be present, and in www.light.cepal.org, the ECLAC website, and also using the accounts of the organization, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. And we would like to greet everyone that accompany us in this room. And I would like to thank the presence of all colleagues and representatives of the media present here. The presentation of the document will be conducted by the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, Mr. José Manuel Salazar-Xirinachs, who is accompanied by the Director of the Productive and Entrepreneurial Division of our organization, Mr. Marcos Chinas, who is responsible for this report, and together with him, part of the team of the Productive and Entrepreneurial Development Division, the officers Susina Plotier, Nuncia Saporito, and others. Following the presentation of the Executive Secretary, we will, of course, allow for a Q&A session. And we remind the representatives of the media that you may contact us and send us your concerns, your queries via the chat in the Zoom platform for those that are connected to Zoom, and to the email conferenciaprensa@cepal.org. Without further ado, then, we offer the floor to the Executive Secretary of ECLAC so that he can launch this publication. Thank you, Guido. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for all of you that are present here physically, and for all those that follow us via streaming to listen to the presentation of this very interesting report that we publish every year on foreign direct investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. And certainly I would like to thank the whole team that worked on this, headed by Marco Ginadas. You will see that this is an in-depth work, and not only updating data in order to understand trends, yearly trends, but also the two special chapters. Because what I will do during this introduction is to, first of all, and as you can see in the contents, this is the order, the contents of the presentation that varies somewhat with compared to the strict components of the report. I would like to highlight the main behavioral results, and that is the first section, the global overview. There, the behavior was very heterogeneous in terms of those countries that originate and that receive foreign direct investment. And we also find a sectorial reshaping reflected in the pattern of announcements of investments in terms of locations and sectors. So with regards to the regional outlook, which is the focus, and that is section 3 in that scheme, One of the main results, if not the main result, is that we registered the maximum reception of foreign direct investment in the region ever since we have statistics in this sense. And it is very interesting to understand the pattern of flows of FDIs in the region in terms of countries, sectors, and the underlying reasons for that. After that, I will present the main results of the two special chapters of the report, one devoted to FDIs on renewable energies and the other one on non-renewable energies. But for the purpose of this presentation and in lieu of time, we have combined both issues and chapters into one single section on this important issue of the energy transition. And here, just to facilitate things and to highlight the three main messages in that sense, first of all, we will say that the non-renewable sectors, despite the fact that in the midterm is disappearing from the world and the region, this process is not going to be a sudden process because of the importance that both reserves and the consumption of fossil fuels have in the region. And in consequence, and also because renewable energies will take time because of investments and because of that transition to occupy the space that they are called upon to hold in the future energy grid in the region. That is the first point. Secondly, in the renewable energy sector, the region is making speedy progress and is building increasing competitive advantages that will enable it not only to make headway in terms of their own decarbonization processes, but also has a potential to make a contribution to the decarbonization of the rest of the world. And we will discuss that in detail as well. And thirdly, foreign direct investment has an important role to play in this process of energy transition, and therefore policies with regards to FDIs and energy policies and productive development policies must be well coordinated and aligned.
And so, in sum, that is the content of the report as well as the presentation. As to the behavior of FDI in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2023, as a form of introduction, since 1995, this report presents the main trends in FDI in the region. As we know, FDI is a very relevant variable since both inward and outward investment flows have the potential to develop capabilities and contribute to technology transfer and productive development in the countries, because as a rule, they bring in the latest in production technology globally. And however, it is important to indicate this, and now that we're going to be talk about the historical high, that these flows alone are not an indicator of a country's economic and social performance. We have the social outlook, the economic outlook, the fiscal outlook, productive development, and so on. And so we should not forget during this presentation that this behavior and these indicators of FDI flows are not equivalent to development. There could be very good news, and this is something that supplements development, but to have a comprehensive approach, we must always think of other indicators, social and economic. And in this edition, in addition to the global and regional overview of FDI and the role of FDI, we're going to talk about energy transition under a couple of chapters on this. And in this sense, we have insisted at ECLAC, and we continue to insist, that the theme of energy transition is one of the sectors that can boost growth and sustainable development in the region. Among others, we have pointed out that we have a list of about 14 or 15 sectors that are very relevant wagers in order to dynamize growth in a region that, unfortunately, in the last decade and since before, in fact, growth has been unsatisfactory. And so then, now getting into our matter regarding the global outlook, the aggregate data is that after the strong recovery shown in 2021, global FDI inflows declined by 12%. As you can see here on the last column, a slight reduction in comparison to 2021, 12%. The total was of $1.29 trillion. That is in the $1.29 trillion in comparison to 1.48 trillion in 2021. So these graphs are thousands of million dollars. That is what they represent. But there was an important differentiated trend because this total drop includes sharp declines in the US, in gray here, and that is the main world recipient, and in some EU countries, but an increase in the rest of the world, which is what you see there in, I don't know if it's blue or green at the top. Although there are many specific reasons to explain the fall, which depends on sectors and expectations, at least three general factors can be noted: the inflationary process, the increase in interest rates, and the general uncertainty that this, plus the geopolitical conditions provoked in 2022. And this is specifically in the financial system. But these factors seem to have affected, as we say in the report, affected developed countries more than the rest of the world. As can be seen in the graph, this trend is strongly marked by negative investments in the EU as a result of large divestments in Luxembourg and the Netherlands. In fact, if we exclude this situation in Luxembourg and the Netherlands, what we can see is an increase in global FDI inflows in 2022 of 11%. 11% instead of the 12% drop. So the impact of Luxembourg is significant and makes an entire difference in the interpretation of the aggregate figures. And we're going to dwell a little further on that. Now, one particular aspect of 2022 was that the announcements of transnational investment projects reflecting future investment intentions increased. The graph on the left shows that the value of FDI project announcements worldwide increased by 64%, reaching nearly 1.2 trillion, or 1.2 trillion value well above the average in 2010s. In the same graph, we know that all regions of the world received higher project announcements. Europe has shown an increasing trend in recent years. Asia Pacific was the region with the second highest number of announcements, and the most notable increase was in Africa and the Middle East, explained by large-scale renewable energy projects in Africa. One element to highlight is that Latin America and the Caribbean has lost weight as a recipient of investment project announcements in the last few years, in comparison to the average of the region in the 2010s. From 2010 to 2019, the region represented 11% of the global amount of project announcements, but in 2022, the weight was only 8%. We have a challenge as a region to continue attracting investment, especially those that support productive, inclusive, and sustainable development. And another relevant element is the sectoral destination of new projects, as you can see in the graph on the right. The worldwide increase was mainly in the energy sectors and in advanced technology, several semiconductors, electronic components, software, and ICTs. The energy sector was key. It is number one there, and both renewable energies and coal and non-renewables such as coal, oil, and gas, as well as high-tech industries. Renewable energies reached a record share of total announcements, becoming the second sector in 2022 by amount of announcements. And then there's a significant increase in project announcements in semiconductors, electronic components, and software and computer services. The metal sector, we should also see this, saw a marked increase metals, announcements in critical metals for the energy transition, such as those used in battery supply chain. And as we said last week when we launched the report on lithium and critical metals. So, how to explain this behavior? This has a lot to do with the new geopolitical conditions in the world, which in turn include new industrial policies implemented by countries such as the US and the EU, where both renewable energies as well as cutting edge technology industries have strong incentives. It is clear that we're facing a process of change and reconfiguration of globalization. Future investment announcements are being impacted by the new geopolitical conditions and the new industrial policies of the advanced economies that are launching new signals, not only signals, but incentives and guidelines for the international relocation of production, so-called reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring by transnationals in some strategic sectors. And of course, we're going to see this because it opens up many opportunities for the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. And this reconfiguration of production is starting to become evident in a reduction of US investment announcements in China. As you can see here in this graph, here we have the announcement of the US FDI, and US is the main origin of FDI project announcements, 217 billion in 2022 in the rest of the world, which is in 18% of the total. And as you can see in the red section at the top, that's China. The amount of project announcements has declined towards China from US and China and reached its lowest in 2022 from 425 projects for approximately 24 billion in 2006 to 74 projects worth approximately 3.7 billion in 2022. On the other hand, there was a remarkable increase in the number of announcements in Europe and a moderate increase in Asia Pacific and Latin America and the Caribbean. The effects of the reconfiguration of global supply chains in the region are still unclear, and its consequences are expected to be felt more in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, both because of their geographic proximity with the US and because of existing trade agreements with the US. But what we're expecting is that the trend that we're beginning to see will deepen this year, 2023. And so now let's take a look at the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean. At aggregate level, as you can see here in the curve, the last 3 years shows that in 2022, 224 billion US dollars entered Latin America and the Caribbean, 55% higher than the figure in 2021, which, when it was of 145 billion. And this is the highest value, the $224 billion, since we have records. Now, it is important to note that since 2013, annual FDI inflows in the region did not exceed $200 billion, which in 2022 becomes a very important milestone. And with this increase, the weight of FDI inflows in the region's GDP increased, and this is the orange curve, and this represented 4% on average of the GDP in the region. In the world, the percentage amounts to 1.7% of world GDP, which shows that in our region, FDI has a higher relative weight in comparison to the world average. And now I'm going to present some elements that explain this trend, in particular, well, by sub-regions and recipient countries, by the main components of the investment sectors and the countries. So let's begin with the sub-regions and countries. The increase in FDI inflows were mainly in South America, as you can see here. In the graph on the left, you can see South America, the Caribbean, and Central America for 2021 and 22. And as you can see, the largest percentage increase was in South America, and basically Brazil. In the Caribbean, the increase was 11%, but in Central America, there was a drop of 12%. But as we will see, this is explained by a specific situation in Guatemala, since in most of the countries, the trend was upward. Now, the graph on the right shows the share of each country of the region. In 2022, we can see that, as happened historically, Brazil was by far, on account of its size and dynamism, the main recipient country with 41% of the total. Brazil is also the country with the highest growth in investments from one year to the next, 56% of the total increase in inflows. And the second largest recipient is Mexico, with 17% of the FDI inflows in 2022, and the rest, Mexico, was followed by Chile, Colombia, Argentina, and Peru in that order, all with higher FDI inflows in 2022 than in 2021. Now, here we can see greater details by country for South America. As can be seen, the increase in FDI inflows was cross-sectional in almost all South American countries. Of course, Brazil, as we said, stands out, but Uruguay and Argentina also had a strong growth in comparison to 2021. The only country that came down slightly was Bolivia. Now, here we can see Mexico and Central American countries. Inflows in Mexico showed a 16% rise in 2022 in comparison to 2021, consolidating, as I mentioned, as the second country with the highest FDI in 2022. In Central America, Costa Rica was the country with the highest FDI inflows, with a slight growth of 2%, while Panama saw a significant recovery inflows and was the second largest recipient country. Now, in Guatemala, which explains a negative variation in the subregion, it is important to clarify that in 2021, they had received an extraordinary amount of FDI due to a sale in the telecommunications sector, and FDI received in 2022 was within the historical averages, and the reduction is really on account of this very high growth of 21. And in the case of Salvador, there were disinvestments in the manufacturing sector that could be offset by investments in services, which were positive, but also reduced in comparison to 2021.
And if we look at the Caribbean, in 2022, it received more investments than in 2021, primarily as a result of investments in the Dominican Republic, which was a second country that received FDIs after Guyana, but that had the largest increase, a 25% increase in the Dominican Republic. Bahamas also experienced an important increase, 19% increase. But in Jamaica, those investments remain stable, and likewise in many countries of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, there was a reduction of investments. The negative investment in Trinidad and Tobago is explained as a result of disinvestment in the fossil fuel sector, primarily in loans between companies. And here we look at the whole region. All countries seem to disappear if we compare that to Brazil, but primarily this is to understand the heterogeneity of the behavior and the countries that have the largest impact at an aggregate level. This graph shows the components of FDIs, which are three: capital contributions. This is a way of dividing. This is the way in which total flows are comprised: capital contributions, reinvestment of profits, and loans between companies. As you can see, in 2022, there's a reinvestment of profit, the orange line that reached a historical maximum, followed by loans between companies, which is the line in gray. Capital contributions had a lower growth, in contrast with the investment of profit and loans between companies. And these capital loans, in general terms, represent companies already operating or present in the company. Sorry, no, the reinvestment of profits is companies that are operating, that reinvest, and likewise loans between companies. But capital contributions are new companies, companies that weren't previously operating in each country. In this sense, we can say that the recovery of FDI in 2022 was promoted primarily by the activity of transnationals that were already operating in countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and that have decided to expand their position in the region. But also with the important contribution of some new investments. If we look at this per sector, separating natural resources, manufacturers, and services, which are shown on this graph, we can see that over the past 3 years, services have concentrated most of the reception of investments, and in 2022, that trend became even more noticeable. Services are represented in gray, 54% of FDIs, of total FDIs in 2022 for services, and that is close to $70 billion. And within that sector, investments in financial services, electricity, gas, water, and services linked to ICTs were the ones that had the biggest share. In terms of manufacturers, well, these investments have been dropping, as you can see on the orange line, since 2026, but they became much more dynamic in 2022. And important investments received in the refining industry in Brazil, and likewise in the automobile industry in Brazil and Mexico. And in terms of natural resources, in 2022, there was renewed interest in investing in natural resources in the region, and this, to a large extent, linked to the energy sector. In terms of countries that are the origin of these investments on the graph, you can see the 11 most important countries of origin of these investments, and the US and the European Union have for years been the major investors, including last year, despite the fact that some changes occurred in that share. The US maintained its position as the main investor with 38% of the total, and that is on the last column, with an increase of investments of 46% compared to 2021. And they were primarily directed towards Mexico and Brazil. As from the EU, investments also increased by 20%. And despite that, they lost 4 share points, whilst investments from the Netherlands and Luxembourg and from Latin America and the Caribbean experienced an increase. With regards future prospects, evaluated as from 2022, there is an improvement as a result of the investment announcements, and this is so despite the fact that there was a drop between 20 and 2021. The amount of new FDI projects increased by 93% in the region in 2022, and that represents close to $100 billion. These values of these announcements focused on major projects, primarily in oil, gas, mining, and renewable energies. In 2022, for the first time since 2010, the projects announced in coal, oil, and gas were the sectors with the greatest share in the region, representing 24% of the total amount. Another sector was the automobile and auto part sector with 13%, followed by renewable energies with 11%, technology-intensive industries with 7%. It is interesting to point out that investments in manufacturers were dynamic in countries and sectors that have already accumulated capabilities over the years, primarily as a result of public policies, proactive public policies that have promoted the construction of clusters in the automobile sector, in aerospace, medical devices, and so on. There we find several virtuous cycles. When a manufacturing capability is created, that in itself becomes a factor to attract and to continue to grow. And that includes electronic components in Mexico, industrial equipment, medical devices in Costa Rica, and other examples. An interesting piece of information, very interesting in fact, is that the amount invested by countries of Latin American origin in other Latin American countries and in the rest of the world, in other words, the trans-Latin companies, reached historical levels last year, with a total close to $75 billion. Which represents an increase of 80% compared to the previous year. This growth was primarily due to investments by Brazil and Mexico, investments abroad. And in Chile, these investments were slightly reduced by 8%, but are still over the average of the last decade and continue to be the third most important origin of FDIs from the region to other countries. And those of Colombia increased by 8%. This performance can be partially explained by a delay in investments announced in 2019 as a result of the pandemic. This is a kind of rebound effect of investments that would have taken place beforehand without the pandemic and without the pandemic of shocks that led to. Now we'll move on to some of the results and messages in two thematic chapters of the report, which are Chapter 2 on non-renewable energies and Chapter 3. And here we have combined both chapters into one single part of this presentation. We are aware that the issue of climate change has meant that the energy transition has become a key issue. Total investments in renewable energy, both national and transnational, public and private, are on the increase. And significantly over the past few years. And last year they totaled $495 billion. At least that is the estimation. Most of these investments are aimed at wind and solar power, which represents 97% of that figure. However, despite that increasing trend, resources are still not enough to reach the necessary thresholds in order to achieve a successful and safe energy transition aligned with the scenarios that limit the increase of global temperature to 1.5% degrees centigrade as developed by the International Energy Agency. According to that agency, to advance towards net zero, the rate of growth of world investments in renewables must be increased threefold, and the rate of expansion of electrical grids must increase sixfold. In other words, we're still very distant from the thresholds that are desirable in order to achieve those objectives. Within this context, the public sector plays a fundamental role in order to develop markets, promote investments, and to have investments incentives in place to induce that type of investments. In developing countries, what is especially relevant is to mobilize resources for the energy transition, and that is where everything that may be achieved via not only national investments, but also the role of foreign direct investment is fundamental importance. In Latin America and the Caribbean, despite the increase in investments, and also as a result of cost reductions, because now as a result of the technological revolution, and it has become much cheaper to invest in solar and wind power, renewable energies still represent only 33% of the primary supply of energy in the region. And that means that we still have a long way ahead. Two-thirds are still not renewable. That is a general context. And now in the next slides, we will have a look at the evolution of these announcement of projects to review the role of FDIs. When we look at the announcements throughout the world, what is evident is the interest in the transition, as shown in this graph. The announcement of projects in the world in 2022 totaled $343 billion, which is 4 times the $83 billion in terms of the announcement of projects in non-renewable energy. And to be able to meet this net zero scenario by 2050 will imply a reduction of the demand of fossil fuels and the promotion of an energy sector which is electrified and with low carbon emissions. And that, as I said, requires us to make speedier advance in this sense. At a world level, we observe an increasing competitiveness in the sector of renewable technologies as a result of the elements that I've already mentioned, the cost reductions and the aggressive incentives adopted by countries. Some interesting data at a world level are that between 2005 and 2022, 6% of announcement of renewable technology projects came from European investors. And within that same period, 66% of the announcements of projects on renewable technologies focused on solar and wind power. And in 2022, there was a strong interest in green hydrogen and other emerging technologies. And 40% of the announcements of renewable energy in the world had to do with green hydrogen, storage, and other emerging technologies. This graph also shows that despite the fact that investments in fossil fuels are at the lowest level since 2000, decade are still relevant and have experienced a strong recovery in 2022. And this is due to the increase of demand within the context of the recovery following the pandemic, and also as a result of supply problems resulting from the war between Russia and the Ukraine. If we focus on Latin America and the Caribbean, the announcement of non-renewable and renewable projects have represented 35% of total FDI projects in 2022 in the region. These were already greater than projects on coal, gas, and oil since 2011, and this indicates a progress in the region towards the energy transition and the attractive nature of everything that is renewable energy. But there is a concentration of these investments. In terms of receiving countries, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Peru, and Colombia concentrated 80% of the total amount of these investments between 2005 and 2022. And in terms of the technologies of interest to investors, wind power and solar power are dominant and represented 70% of the total in the region out of the total of announced projects. The year with the highest number of projects in renewable energy was 2019. After that, that was reduced in 2020 and 2021 and recovers in 2022. In terms of non-renewables, there is a pattern, and that is that the projects announced are associated to the discovery of new reserves, and also as a result of regulatory changes. For example, the recovery in 2022 is explained primarily as a result of the announcement of an investment of $10 billion on the part of the U.S. company ExxonMobil in Guyana, following the discovery of the potential of the Starbrook field. And this is a characteristic of that dynamic. That can be a year with these massive investments that obviously have a tremendous impact on the data of a specific year. This is the reality that we face, a strong dynamic movement in renewable and also non-renewable energies. We are presently undergoing an energy transition, and despite the increase of investments in non-renewables, these today still represent only 33% of the primary supply of energy in the region. So we still have a long way to go, and what we must say here, because there are some big discussions here in some countries about these issues, that the transition will take time, and in the meantime, non-renewables will continue to be significant. Finally, some recommendations that we will review now.
The first recommendations has to do with the opportunity represented by energy transition in contributing to productive development in the region. And this involves the need for coordination and alignment among energy policies as such, traditional ones, and new policies for productive development. And despite market incentives, they are the main driver. Well, there are incentives that drive FDI in energy, but it is important to bear in mind a series of supplementary policies in terms of science, technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, and human talent. This is key because many of the renewables require far more qualified talent than is normally available, and relation with universities and the academic sector is very relevant. So there is a series then of recommendations, above all, the need to strengthen the FDI agencies. Most countries have specialized agencies. The legal frameworks are insufficient, but you have special economic areas, post-establishment activities. Many of the experts and people who work in this area, they say that the easy part is attracting a company. The difficult thing is once they set up, on account of the subsequent work and the post-establishment. And lastly, it is important to reiterate that although the entire report has to do with flows and the challenges of policies for FDI, this is only one more instrument within a broader framework. In order to make use of this, it is very important that countries should develop this institutionality and pay great attention to, once they're set up, having the chains for the development of local providers of good practices post setup. And so here there is one new factor that we've already mentioned that has to do with the relocation that is occurring on account of the geopolitical as well as the industrial policies. There is a concept of connecting and relating to these policies. Some legislation in USA allows not only for the multinationals, but there are incentives that they should be set up not only in the US but in nearby areas, Mexico, Central America, South America. So there's a very significant fertile ground there to make use of this relocation and having the productive chains. So basically, we have recommendations in terms of promoting active policies for the long term and make the most of the relocation opportunities, renting strategic sectors. This idea that it is important to wager on driving sectors, the dynamites, that are critical in a region that is characterized with very low growth rates. In the last decade, the average growth in Latin America has been of only 0.8%, less than the 2% of the famous lost decade of the 80s. And the relevance of using a series of instruments and supplementary things such as the list that appears here, human development, and policies for FDI are not simply what is done by the agencies to attract investment. And then lastly, governance of these policies to better connect up public-private efforts, what we do with the clusters, and where they include the academic sector, laboratories, technology, and science and technology. And at the end of the day, these investments come to specific territories. And as our boss here in the Division of Productive Development says, that local productivity is local. In order to add based on an ample base, this is key. In addition to policies to attract FDI, and that somehow breaks the natural trend for everything to be concentrated in certain sectors, in urban areas, because we must think of equity and opportunities in different territories. And this cannot be forced, you cannot decree it. You must create the conditions in each territory in order to attract high quality investments. So thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Executive Secretary. And now we're going to begin the round of Q&A. Of course, we thank you for the great interest, and we have already received some of your concerns. The first Executive Secretary comes from Valentina Bastias from the Xinhua Agency in China, and she has asked the following. What has been the role and trajectory of Chinese FDI in Latin America and the Caribbean? What are the potential areas of cooperation in which Chinese investment can contribute to the region's growth and productivity? And how can the region take advantage of and effectively channel this FDI from China? Well, thank you very much for that question. Well, China investment had a first stage from 2000 through 2010, characterized by investments in hydrocarbons, metal mining, agriculture, and fishing. As of 2010, there was a second phase with a gradual process of diversification with investments in electricity, construction of transportation infrastructure, mainly ports, and to a lesser extent, manufacturing, the financial sector, and information and communication technology. Now, all of this is correct, but we see in the report, and this is what has called our attention, that FDI flows from China to LAC is much less than its importance in terms of trade and its importance in the construction of infrastructure by Chinese companies and financed by Chinese companies or entities. So this can be due to three things. A lot of investments were made through the purchase of companies that were already foreign owned, which means that these businesses are not reflected as FDI inflows to the region in the balance of payments. And second, part of the investments of Chinese companies entered via third countries. For example, the Luxembourg or the Cayman Islands effects, and so therefore the official statistics underestimate the weight of Chinese companies, but that are recorded as coming from Luxembourg or other origins. And finally, an important part of the activity of Chinese companies is carried out through construction contracts or infrastructure projects and not through the establishment of firms which do not constitute FDI. And by the way, it is a great contribution made by China to the construction of infrastructure in the region. From 2011 and 2022, this was done by Chinese companies, but from 2022, the percentage was of only 8%. So there has been a bit of a change, 8 and 3%, respectively. And that is the reality, and I think that is what this explains. Thank you. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. And so now the correspondent, Carmen Esquivel from Agencia Latina, and wanted to ask you a question. Please go ahead.
I would like to know whether you have conducted a study on the behavior of foreign direct investment in Cuba. What are the potentials that that country has, and the impact of the portfolio of opportunities there? That is the issue that concerns me in the case of Cuba. Thank you, Carmen. Well, we have certainly monitored Cuba and other countries as well, and we have conducted specific studies. What I can say there is that during 2022, there was progress in the attraction of new businesses and new investments in accordance with our data. 35 new investments took place in Cuba, 18 more than in 2021, with a total committed capital of more than $400 million, which is 200 million more than in 2021. And in terms of the portfolio opportunities published by MINSEX of Cuba, the priority sectors for the Cuban government have been the production of food, with 28% of the total portfolio, tourism 18%, oil 16%, and industry 14%. In terms of joint work that we have conducted with the Cuban government, we have identified that the main opportunities are associated with the promotion of exports, which is important to receive foreign currency in the island, given the restrictions, the access restrictions that it has to international markets. And among the most attractive sectors, we find biopharmaceutical products because of the country's capabilities, traditional exports of nickel, rum, tobacco, sugar, and others, the exploration of new initiatives such as cobalt, which is a mineral where Cuba holds the third largest world reserve of that mineral, and also IT services and other professional services where Cuba has a critical mass of professionals. In terms of this question, the portfolio of opportunities, well, this is important in terms of policy designs, and it involves several benefits. It structures and updates all the information on investment projects, and that's it is good to have that type of data. It systematizes information per investment sectors, amounts, and provinces, and it also has a one-stop shop for foreign investment, which is an incentive in the sense that it enables speedier permits, licenses, and authorizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmen. And now we move on to the next question by Frida Andrade, reporter of the Grupo Reforma in Mexico. Questions is, what is the reason for Mexico's FDI performance in 2022, and what are the reasons behind its growth? And how is FDI in Mexico expected to behave in 2023, considering that by the end of the year it will be closer to the presidential elections? Frida Andrade from the Grupo Reforma. Yes, thank you. Well, there are several reasons that are relevant behind that behavior of FDI in Mexico. First of all, the geographic location, which is, of course, next to one of the largest markets in the world, and where Mexico takes part strongly and is one of the countries that most benefits from these trend towards nearshoring, so the relocation of companies and investments in the changing globalization that the world is experiencing. Of course, this would not happen if Mexico did not have a favorable investment climate conditions that include the availability of skilled labor, the existence of the free trade agreement between Mexico and the US and Canada. And we must also add the other effect that I mentioned earlier, that Mexico is already a highly industrialized country. It has clusters for industries, automotive software, and modern services. And when you already have competitiveness and you have the critical mass, you have the human resources, you have the logistics for the transportation, production, and you have a connection with a series of appropriate institutions, all of this helps create virtuous growth circles. And so in Mexico, FDI inflows increased in 2022 for the third consecutive year, driven by both growth in capital inflows, new investments, as well as the reinvestment of company profits, which is another virtuous circle. Once the companies are there and the businesses are doing well, so to speak, they grow with the gains made in that same country. And the two most dynamic sectors in terms of FDI attraction in Mexico were services and manufacturing. In the case of services, there was an extraordinary increase in investments in the film and video industry due to the merger between the Grupo Televisa of Mexico and Univision of the US, and in air transport with the restructuring of Aeromexico, among other things, and also in manufacturing. Investments grew in basic metal industries and in the food industry. Transportation, vehicle manufacturing is one of the main recipients of FDI and received 12% of the total investments in 2022. And how is the investment in Mexico expected to behave in 2023? Well, in the report, there is major indication and evidence that this will deepen in 2023, this trend towards nearshoring and outshoring, a new term, on account of the geopolitical conditions and the reconfiguration of value chains. And so it's to be expected that this trend that is already clear in 2022 should deepen in 2023. In the first quarter of 2023, FDI represented $18.6 billion in Mexico. And if you, the extraordinary flows of 22 are omitted, FDI flows show a growth of 17.2%. So, based on this, for the first quarter, it would seem that the trend may continue. Thank you.
Now I'd like to offer the floor to Ivan Morales, who is a journalist from Confidencial of Nicaragua. And here his question is the following. What are the causes of the behavior of FDIs in Nicaragua, and what is your projection for the next years, considering the political and business climate in the world, in the country? Thank you, Mr. Olivares, for your question. Well, the data that we have is that in 2022, Nicaragua received 6% more investments than the previous year. And that is the result of the reinvestment of profits by foreign companies already operating in the country. And in other components, capital contributions and loans between companies less investments were received. We don't really have a forecast about FDI in Nicaragua, and in these scenarios that you mentioned, well, it would be very speculative on our part, given the factors that you yourself mentioned in your question.
Thank you. And now we move on to the correspondent of the ANSA agency, Margarita Matias. So, in the wars in 1990s, there was a surge in FDI due to privatization, which led to a growth in the region's economies. If in 2022, FDI in Latin America and the Caribbean reached its highest historical value, why are we in a period of economic contraction? Where are these resources going, considering that poverty is affecting more than 200 million Latin Americans and Caribbean people? That is the question by Margarita Bastias from ANSA, Italy. Thank you. I would like to invite Martinosa to answer this question. Well, thank you very much, Margarita, for that very good question. And we would begin by saying that one element to keep in mind is that FDI is a component of investment in our countries. And so we should highlight the lag in terms of investment that a region like Latin America and the Caribbean has. In 2022, for example, the region invested approximately 19.5% of its GDP, which is significantly lower than the one observed in other regions. And so this low level of investment is, at the end of the day, is an obstacle for economies to move towards more productive, inclusive, and sustainable development. And so we must also mention the structural endemic issue that we've been insisting on at ECLAC, and that is that our region, unfortunately, has stagnant productivity over the last decade, and which reflects in lower levels of growth, and that once again do not allow addressing the issues of poverty and extreme poverty more forcefully. Now, moving on to FDI as such, we should also mention that the fact that FDI arrives on their own is insufficient for these investments to have a spillover effect and productive change in the economy. As the Executive Secretary has insisted, it is necessary to implement all types of supplementary policies and agendas to make the most of the FDI. So it's more than just policies. It is essential for countries to raise their level of ambition in terms of productive development policies, and that they frame investment attraction and export promotion efforts within these broader frameworks and efforts. Productive development policies, as the Executive Secretary said, play a key role in directing investments towards sectors because they can provide the regulatory incentives and instruments in order to develop industries and sectors. And so, as has been reiterated in the light of the question, aside from FDI, there's a series of other factors that restrict the ability to grow of our countries and that we will have to address with a productive development policy that is far more ambitious and that will allow us to take on these challenges related to poverty and respond to the social demands by the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ginas. Now we'll move on to the question of Javier Martin, correspondent from the Spanish news agency. He asks, why does the study state that certain levels of investments will not be maintained in 2023, and whether you believe that the EU ECLAC summit will confirm this trend and will facilitate the increase of European investments in Latin America and the Caribbean? Thank you very much. Well, the doubt about 2023 is related primarily to the economic slowdown, both at a world level in general and also of the Latin American region, and the uncertainty associated to macroeconomic conditions. We don't have a crystal ball. These things rely heavily on country perceptions, the dynamic nature of some specific sectors. A countertrend to that negative aspect is what we have already mentioned in terms of the reconfiguration of the geographic aspects of the investments, and that could be an effect that prevails over and above other macroeconomic uncertainty effects, which can lead to greater dynamic aspects in certain countries. Now, with regards to the EU-ECLAC summit, well, I believe that this is a very important summit that takes place after 8 years without a summit. As we know, in this interdependent world, alliances, both for political issues and for economic aspects, are fundamental so that we can manage and deal with interdependence. The EU submitted a very interesting proposal a few weeks ago via initiatives such as a European Fund for Sustainable Development, what they call the Global Gateway, which is an initiative aimed at increasing public and private investments in Latin America in a whole series of dynamic sectors, beginning with energy transition and so on. And therefore, the discussion on economic cooperation, on cooperation for financing, well, that will be discussed by heads of state. There will be an entrepreneurial forum that will be very important, that I have indeed been invited to participate. And as ECLAC, we have produced a document that we will distribute, and that puts forward those 14 or 15 areas of promoting sectors as areas of opportunity in order to bring to the fore the opportunities that Latin America has in those sectors and their importance. And it involves pharmaceutical industry, medical devices, the tremendous environmental aspects, electromobility, energy transition, circular economy, the issue of bioeconomics, the export of services via ICTs facilitated by internet and so on. The whole issue of gender equality and the society of care that do not qualify as a traditional sector, but it is indeed one of the sectors that will expand most, and hopefully policies will be aligned in the future, partly as a result of demographic changes, as a great demand for the care, given the aging of the population, not only of children, but also of the elderly, and that will imply a tremendous source of employment. We have set forth all these aspects. Those sectors have a tremendous potential for cooperation with the EU, and I would say that the fact that this summit is being held, the fact that there are good political relations, means that we're very enthusiastic in terms of promoting prosperity, and we hope that this summit will indeed make a very positive contribution in that sense.
I will switch briefly to English because we have received a question from a colleague from Guyana, Denis Chabrol of the Demerara Waves News, and he asked the following: why is that the wealth derived from FDI is not reaching the broad masses of people to take them out of poverty?
Thank you very much for the question. I think there are several reasons. First, what we have already said, foreign direct investment flows can make a big difference and can have transformational effects in small economies, but they are not the whole development agenda. And their effects in larger economies is even more difficult because a large economy has many other aspects to move the economic dynamics and the total investment levels. Secondly, these foreign direct investment flows always have a complementary role to local efforts. Many conditions have to be right for economic and social development to occur. It is not reasonable to expect that despite the importance of foreign direct investment that we have been talking about, it will by itself develop a country. I mean, I think anyone that expects that foreign direct investment will be the hope for development, I think it would be exaggerating the role. This is an important role, but it is complementary. And third, despite the record high flows in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2022 that we have documented, we still face a huge investment deficit that we have been accumulating for many years. We have only been experiencing rates of investment of around 18%, and this value is significantly lower than the one observed in other regions. And the other reason one might say is that many of these investments flows, because of their nature, they come in sectors which are capital intensive. So when you compute the amount of, when you estimate, calculate the amount of jobs that they create, even though in many cases there are good jobs, there are high qualification jobs, the great mass of employment to really create employment and prosperity in the countries is in other sectors, which unfortunately do not participate from foreign direct investment flows or from the global economy. This is what originates what is called, what we call the dualism phenomenon. So it is very, very important then to have policies to work on the non-tradable sectors, in the informal economy, in the agricultural sectors, et cetera, the small and medium-sized enterprises, which really constitute most of the productive tissue of the countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll switch to Spanish again. Esteban Ramírez,
editor of newspaper La Nación from Costa Rica, sent the following question. We would like to know that if in Central America, and especially in Costa Rica, we will still have the same trends to attract FDIs that we have seen in the region, a strong growth in the services sector and the reinvestment of profit, or whether there are other specific aspects linked to its geographic location, its closeness to the US, and what is the origin of those investments? Which countries are the main providers of FDIs to Central America? I wouldn't say that Costa Rica is at an average level or aligned with the average trend, in the sense that it is a country, as we well know, that has at least 20 or 30 years of conducting policies to attract FDIs in a very systematic and proactive fashion as part of public policies, with high-quality institutions that have even received international awards as agencies to attract investments and so on. And thus, there is a know-how in this sense there. And there's also something very important that we have already mentioned, a critical mass in certain sectors. The main export of Costa Rica, as we know, is medical devices. There are practically 50 multinationals operating there. There is a robust system of suppliers of more than 120 companies on top of those 50 multinationals. And therefore, as we said, these are virtuous circles where there is an important basis, and therefore the success leads to more success, unless, of course, mistakes are made or important changes are made. And likewise, with regards to the modern services sector, that represents another 25% of the total of exports of goods and services in Costa Rica, and therefore the inflow of FDIs that we have in the report represented $3.6 billion in 2021, which meant that Costa Rica was the main receiver of FDIs in Central America. And in terms of components, we continue to observe the trend in the region of reinvestment of profit that continued to represent 71% of total investments. And again, we see that once there is a critical mass of multinationals, the reinvestment of profits by those same multinationals become one of the main growth elements, whilst the rest was 30%. With regards to sectors, manufacturers, 68% of the total, and there medical devices is very important, and also in services that represented 33% of the total. With regard to the countries of origin, and this is the result of its geographic location and because of historical reasons, the US represented 73% of the total inflows in 2022. There was an increase of investments from Switzerland that represented 9%, and other countries, Colombia, Mexico, Spain, and Germany, with the percentages lower than 5% each. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. And now I will pass on the question from El País, España, Isabel Acota. She asks, what does it mean, capital contribution? Does this refer to brick and mortar investment? This FDI includes revenues in the US, for example, the famous unicorns in technology, the technology sector. And what about this investment in Luxembourg? What do you mean how does this have an impact on the region? And finally, the fact that FDI reached a record high last year, did this surprise you? Or was it part of the post-COVID rebound as expected? This is the concern by Isabela Cota from El País in Spain. Well, thank you very much, Isabella, for these questions with regard to what capital contribution means. As was said in the presentation regarding the national accounts, FDI is divided into three components. On the one hand, capital contributions, and second, reinvestment of profits, and third, loans among companies. And capital contributions are included as greenfield investment and mergers and acquisitions. And these capital contributions are included in foreign capital inflows for activities, either investment in shares or purchase of land, purchase of movables, machinery, intangibles, and so on. And then with regard to the second question on whether the FDI includes revenue funds in the US and if this includes the famous unicorns, here it is worth saying that not necessarily, because often these enterprises do have their home offices outside the region, and so in principle there shouldn't not be a major impact on the flows into the region. With regard to Luxembourg, this clearly is a figure that makes a little noise, as the Executive Secretary mentioned already, in terms of how investment worldwide dropped to 12%, but it appears as growing. And if we take out the Luxembourg effect, it is worth mentioning that according to information by the Luxembourg Central Bank, this is explained on account of restructuring or the transfer of activities of financial participation societies that involved large sums of money. And in fact, there were also negative outflows of major sizes in 2022 in the country. And so therefore it is not possible to know if this may or not have an impact on the region. But in principle, we would estimate that these are activities of financial restructuring that should not have a direct impact on a region such as Latin America and the Caribbean. And lastly, with regard to the question on whether we were surprised by this new record FDI, it is worth, of course, recognizing that in the face of such uncertainty as we find today in a world context of major geopolitical tensions and so on, and the fact that the region has presented growth rates that are low, well, such a major growth was not to be expected in terms of increases in FDI arrivals. But it is also worth mentioning, and this was said in the presentation, the region had received important announcements of investments in 2019, and the realization of this was postponed on account of the pandemic. And so it was to be expected that the rise in the levels of investment was to be expected. But On account of the same reason, it is possible that the dynamism in 2023 will not necessarily be sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco Ginas. And we now have a question of the correspondent of the Reuters press agency, Natalia Ramos. Her question is the following. Could you discuss the fact that the main investments are in coal, oil and gas? Is the renewable energy market spent in the region, and changes in the taxation policies that have been implemented by Colombia or that certain countries seek, such as Brazil and Chile, could they have an impact upon the inflow of investment or on projects that are in the pipeline? Cecilia Plotier, you will answer that question. Thank you, Natalia Ramos. First of all, there was a strong growth of announcements on coal, oil, and gas in the region, but as mentioned during the presentation, with major projects in Guyana and in Mexico. And at the level of investment, there was a recovery of projects in oil refining and others as a result of the impact of the international context, the energy crisis, the impact of the war in the Ukraine, and so on. And therefore, it is true that there is a recovery of FDIs in non-renewable energies. But one cannot say that the market of renewables in the region is spent. In fact, in Chapter 3 of the document, there is a study, an in-depth study about investments in renewable energies both in the world and in the region. And we understand that there are many opportunities for Latin America in order to continue to deepen the energy transition and to continue to invest in renewable energies. And in fact, the announcement of investment projects in renewable energy, despite the fact that in 2022, as a result of a specific reason, they didn't really have a very good position between 2010 and up until 2021, they had remained as the sector that received the largest amount of project announcements. So I believe that it is true that investments in coal, oil and gas, but investments in renewable energy will continue to increase in order to ensure the energy transition and also the supply of energy for all inhabitants in our region, where we still face a major challenge. And with regard to taxation policies, well, clearly, taxation changes have an impact on investment policies, but this is something that we have to analyze on a country and sector by sector analysis. We cannot provide a general answer about how or about the impact that this will have. We have to take into consideration fiscal changes, but in terms of the attraction of investment, there are many other elements that impact the reception of foreign direct investment beyond taxation issues, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary. For example, when we have productive ecosystems with certain advantages and capabilities, well, that becomes attractive for companies, and therefore often that can have a greater importance when a multinational decides to invest in a region than fiscal changes.
And now the questions sent in by the El Mercurio paper from Chile, Joaquin Aguilera, the reporter. In Chile last year, there were historical figures in regard to FDI. What could explain these results and that where have these new investments focused? And how could lesser political uncertainty have an impact on the decisions by investors with regard to investments in Chile? Thank you, Joaquin, for that question, more specifically relevant because Chile is the third investment destination in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so I'd like to begin saying that FDI inflows in Chile in 2022, as shown in the presentation, reached $865 million, a 31% increase in comparison to 2021, and the highest figure of the last 7 years. This dynamism in investment reflects a major recovery of foreign company activities post-pandemic and also shows a renewed trust by foreign investors in the country. This confidence is reflected in that the reinvestment of profits was the most important aspect that increased by 138%, whereas capital contributions represented 42% of the total. And it is also important to mention that in Chile, a significant effort has been made to attract investment in sectors such as renewable energy, technological infrastructure, agribusiness, innovation, and green hydrogen. So having an agency to promote investment with clear guidelines such as Chile has is a factor that does contribute to confidence building. Thank you.
Thank you. We have reached the end of the time that was available for this meeting. However, I would like to mention that during this press conference, many other concerns have been received, and we thank you all for your questions about contents, figures, and proposals submitted by ECLAC. And we have not been able to answer the ones that we have not answered directly during this event. We will answer in writing during the course of today. And we will answer to El Universal de México, Rosa María Pascal from Prensa Gráfica, in El Salvador, Francisco Bravo from the Sputnik Agency, Paula Santibáñez from Valor Futuro, Clara Cepeda from La Jornada of Mexico, Alma Solís from SNIP News from Panama, and Natalia González from the TELAM Agency in Argentina. We will do our best to answer our answers, to provide our answers in writing to the questions that you have been kind enough to pose during this event. For the more than 70 journalists that have been connected via Zoom to this conference, and for the colleagues that have accompanied us face-to-face here in ECLAC, well, the document is available to you all. Likewise, a presentation delivered by the Executive Secretary and all the supplementary informational material that can be useful for a better coverage and of course, the permanent willingness of our public information division to answer to all the requirements and questions that you may have. Executive Secretary, before we conclude this conference and the launching of this very relevant report, I would like to offer you the floor for a final message. Thank you very much. The message is to thank you for your interest, to thank you for your presence here, and also via streaming of so many journalists. Thank you very much for your interest. As we have said, and as you well know, this is a fundamental issue, and it is also an issue that is permanently changing. The nature of the challenges are not the same compared to a decade ago. To talk about direct foreign investment and investment flows refers to interdependence, to how we benefit from our relations with the rest of the world. And as we know, in a process of globalization that is so quickly changing within the context of an era of technological revolution, where many of these flows will be fundamental for technological transfer, for learning, for job creation, and where it is important to understand the geopolitical, economic dynamics and the dynamics of flows. And therefore, it's important to conduct this serious analysis, this review of statistics. And we're very proud to be able to do that as from ECLAC. So I would like to thank the team that worked on this and that works on this every year and that monitors this permanently. Thank you very much. As you can all see, this involves a tremendous effort that this year was devoted to a key sub-theme beyond looking at, goes beyond looking at the trends, and that has to do with the energy transition issue. Thank you very much for all of that. And as messages, well, we have insisted on this, but in the major narrative of development in Latin America, one of the issues where we're lagging behind is when it comes to economic growth. And this is not a distortion on the part of ECLAC, but with mediocre growth, we will not be able to overcome development and create quality employment, or reduce poverty, reduce informality, and so on. And so these issues on how that relate to how we can have greater investment rates, and in order to achieve more prosperity and to advance towards inclusive and sustainable development are key aspects in the major narrative of development of Latin America and the Caribbean, and that is why we insist on this. And there, foreign direct investments plays such an important role. Thank you very much for your interest and for your presence here. Thank you.